Morning, everybody.
Well, I see some familiar faces, or at least and names. So that's, I don't, you know, fortunately, I don't see the name of, any of the people I stole this presentation from. So that's good.
You.
But you've got a good audience, Gary.
Yeah, it looks like it. How are you, Stan?
Doing well. I'm just really happy so many people were able to join us.
Of course.
Me too. So I'll be letting people in as we go on here, but let's go ahead and get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual nature talk from Gary Poole. I'm really glad you could join us today.
Thank you.
Before we get, what, Gary?
No, I just said I'm happy to be here.
Oh, great. So before we get started with Gary, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Phil Hardberger Park Conservancy. The Conservancy is a member-based nonprofit that bridges the gap between San Antonio and nature by bringing free nature programs to the public. So they also protect the natural habitat of the park through advocacy, fundraising, and promotion. If you enjoy the programs that we offer in the park, please consider supporting the Conservancy through a donation or by becoming a member. Visit philhardbergerpark.org to learn more. So this talk will be recorded and shared on our website. So please turn off your video and mute your microphone. This will help reduce background noise. So today we have Gary Poole here to talk with us today. So Gary, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Well, first of all, let me ask, can y'all hear me okay? Is it okay? Sounds good.
Yes.
So today's talk is, title is, I think, rocks, soils, and plants. And of course, any one of those things would be, an hour program in and of itself. So this is not going to be an exhaustive talk and hopefully not exhausting. But please do ask questions if you have them. I think, it's set up. You can, if you're not familiar with Zoom, there's a chat icon down at the bottom, and and I see good morning from Jessica and Anna. So you can click that icon and ask your question. I think our moderator will let me know what those questions are, and because I love to talk about any of these things, and I don't know what people don't know. So I'm just going to cover the topic as best I can. So I will, I think, go ahead and start, unless if there are no questions at this point. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. And we'll start. Fix this. So give myself a laser pointer. Oh yeah, that's good. So let's start at the beginning, like a good story. In the beginning, there was something like this in space, where our solar system is now. It's about 4.5 billion years ago. So planetary nebula. This is an actual photograph taken using radio telescopes of a solar system in process of formation. And I started here because, we're talking about rocks, we're talking about geology, and this is the beginning of geology for us, because this is the beginning of the formation of our planets. And with the formation of our planets, we go from cosmology to something a little more local, geology. So this was about 4.5 billion years ago. Now, it's also important to note that, in this nebula, solar nebulas, it's, the planets and the sun or the star are in process of forming. Obviously, this is not our nebula, but this is comparable. All the elements that we have on our planet now were somewhere out there, dust particles, molecules, elements, atoms of uranium, calcium, oxygen, all those things that make up everything, those elements, and were in this nebula. And those, of course, formed earlier, in earlier generations of stars. So, but we benefited from that because without all those other elements, life and rock would not be possible. So this is the beginning. So if you look at a representation of time, geologic time, since formation of our planet and our solar system, we can represent it in this kind of circular graph. And let me see if I can employ my laser pointer. So about 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth formed, and relatively quickly there was life on Earth, as near as we can determine. We have evidence of early life from around 4 billion years ago. And so somewhere around here on our time scale, after the Earth was no longer molten, it was repeatedly molten because of impacts during this period, but relatively quickly after it calmed down and there was water on Earth, liquid water, life formed. Now this was what we call primitive life, in that there were single-celled creatures that had no nucleus, so called there's prokaryotes, but and so the DNA and just kind of floated around within the cell membrane, and then about 3 billion years ago, we see the beginning of photosynthesis. Now we're still talking about single-celled creatures with no nucleus, but these are things we call nowadays, one term is cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. It's not really an algae, but it could do photosynthesis. And so that was a significant step, but still that was 3 billion years ago. And it's not until almost 2 billion years, actually more than 2 billion years into Earth's history, that we actually have life with a cell, with a nucleus in it. So beginning a little over 2 billion years ago, we have single-celled creatures with a nucleus. And this is a significant step because so many of the functions, including the repository of DNA and the production of different amino acids and energy, reside in that nucleus of the cell. And so that's a big step. And from that point, we see really an acceleration of development of life on the planet. We have multicellular life beginning about 1.7 billion years ago. So that's about 3 billion years after the formation of the Earth. In multicellular, very simple creatures, think of, like jellyfish situations, but still, an improvement with differentiation of functions within different parts of that multicellular organism. So for our purposes, because we're kind of interested in plants, among other things, the first land plants began about here, almost 500 million years ago. So before that point, the land was pretty bare. It's likely that there were things on the land, like lichen-like things, or probably algae and standing water on the land, but not terrestrial plants as such. And they didn't look like the plants that we see today, but they did have, vascular systems. So they had structure, and they had differentiation, function in that structure. So, and then our particular area of the world, and because this is Hardberger Park, and so we're really interested in focusing on Hardberger Park and all these things, our particular part of the world began looking like itself around here, about 100 million years ago, in the Cretaceous period. So that's when we can talk about the formations being deposited, the rocks that we see there now being formed. And so that is what is of interest to us. Another representation of the geologic timescale, because this allows us to see very precisely where our particular part of history lies. And it's right here, this kind of in the Cretaceous period, right in the boundary between early and late Cretaceous. So you'll notice that this top part is kind of misleading because this top part here that is the bulk of this graph or this graphic, this top part represents about 500 million years, but the entire thing is 4.5 billion years. So, time is kind of crunched up here. But for us, the Cretaceous period, the Middle Cretaceous, the beginning of the Late Cretaceous is where we are interested. That's our point of interest. This is what the world looked like, or at least what North America looked like at that point in geologic time. The late Cretaceous saw this big inland waterway in North America. Global temperatures were a lot warmer then than now. There was no ice at the poles, so water levels or sea levels were considerably higher. This shading represents depths of water, and so we can see that our part of Texas here was in relatively shallow water. In fact, periodically, the bed of the sea was exposed to the air because we have, unconformities between some of the layers of rock that we find in this part of Texas now that were forming then. So we can see it was definitely warmer. The equator was nearby. In fact, it's just off the screen here. It ran through the northern part of South America. And because remember, think about the world, plate tectonics, continental drift. So as these tectonic plates were moving around, they'd put them in different positions on the Earth. And so at this point in time, it's not that the equator was really in a different place on the globe of the Earth, it's that the land masses were in different places on that same globe. And so our particular land mass was basically in a tropical part of the world. And so we can expect that temperatures were very warm, the types of life to be found were appropriate to that climate. In our part of Texas, and this is these are kind of what we think of as I characterize it as named rock layers. We don't see all of these rocks in the park, but they're close by, and we can see them near the park, all of them. Of course, the Edwards limestone is the oldest. It is the source of our drinking water or the majority of our drinking water here in San Antonio. It is a thick, massive, very porous limestone. The Del Rio clay sits on top of that, and some of y'all we stumble across some of the fossils from the Del Rio clay all the time in San Antonio. So little ram's horn bivalves that you see. They look like snails, but they're really not. But that's, again, that Del Rio clay, neither the Del Rio clay nor the Edwards limestone are exposed in the park. The Edwards is about 100 feet below your feet when you're walking on the trails in Hardberger Park. The first formation that we do see, the oldest formation that we do see in Hardberger is the Butte limestone. Butte limestone is a fairly thick, fairly massive limestone. And I'll show you some pictures of it in just a bit. And the only place you can really see it in the park is in the exposures along Salado Creek, kind of in that northeastern corner of the park. And on top of that is the Eagleford Shale. As the name implies, it's a shale. The difference between a limestone and a shale or considerable limestone is primarily calcium carbonate. It can be formed in different ways. The Butte limestone was formed as a small particles of like a limey mud in the bottom of a tropical sea, very shallow water, about probably 20 feet deep or so, warm, very warm, but also very turbulent. The Eagleford Shale, on the other hand, which sits on top of the Butte limestone, is composed of silt and clay particles primarily. It's rich in calcium carbonate as well, but that's a minority of its material. So it is compared to the limestones, a very soft formation. And in fact, there are no real exposures of the Eagleford Shale, even though you're walking on it, because by the time in the park, it's all basically deteriorated to soil. It's so soft. So On top of the Eagleford Shale, and the youngest formation that we see in the park is the Austin Chalk. A lot of places around town where you see nice exposures of the Austin Chalk in both the creek beds, Salado and Leon Creek. There's some really great exposures, and of course, a lot of road cuts around town. The Austin Chalk, at least a part of it in the park, consists of inner kind of some beds that are really soft and have a lot of clay in them, and some beds that are really hard with very dense calcium carbonate. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But those are the formations that we find. The top three are the formations we find in the park. The Butte limestone is the oldest, the Eagleford Shale on top of it, and the Austin Chalk at the very top. So, of course, here's the park. We can see Salado Creek there to the right on this map, and then the Urban Ecology Center on the left part of the map. That red line, imagine yourself on the north side of that line looking back at that red line. And if you could like slice away the earth at that point, like you're cutting into a cake and looking at the layers of that cake, those layers would look something like this if they were nicely labeled, which, So again, looking at this, we're kind of reversed, because we're on the north side of that red line, but you can see where Salado Creek is there on the left side of the schematic. In that the creek there exposes that purple formation, which is the Butte limestone. And so you can see it's on top of it, there's alluvium and kind of remnant deposits, many of which are kind of lithified, but they're just like alluvial deposits on top of the Butte at that point. There's a black line there, which is a fault. And you cross that fault, and you'll notice on one side the formations are the same, but they're shifted down. And of course, we don't know which direction, which side went up, which side went down, because the only thing that really concerns us when we talk about faults is the relative movement. That's a normal fault. The hanging wall went down, standing wall went up relative to each other. And you can see that as a result of that fault, when you get to the other side of the park, on the other side of that fault, the formations at the surface are the younger formations. And we see the Eagleford Shale there, and then we can see the hilltops or the higher elevations have the Austin Chalk on them. So that's pertinent to the formation of the types of soils that we see in most of the park. That fault, and that fault, as far as I can see, I mean, I haven't been able to find anywhere on the surface where it is obvious. You can go into Salado Creek. And if you go into Salado Creek and walk down the creek a ways, you can find that fault in the rock that's exposed there. But in the park itself, there's no place that I have found where that fault is obvious. Here's another
We have a question from Liz Robbins asking, where is the bridge?
Okay. The bridge. The new land bridge is right here. So, and we'll talk a little, well, we won't really talk about the land bridge, but I mean, it is interesting that you bring, talking about the land bridge, because I want to, please notice where the Waterloo Trail, I mean, those of you that hike the trails, probably these are all familiar names to you. But I'm going to refer to this Waterloo Trail in a bit, so please note where that is on the map. If is that the question? Did that answer the question? I hope so. Please let me know if it did not.
Liz just added in the next slide.
Oh, well, it's not really in this slide. I mean, you can see where Wurzbach Road is here. So, yeah, the bridge, and so we're crossing Wurzbach Road here, and with this imaginary line. So Wurzbach is right here. So this part represents the eastern side of the park. This is the western side of the park, kind of. It is not, perfect, but
Liz just commented, "Oh, I see it. Sorry."
Oh, no worries, but I'll keep talking about it. Anyway. So this is another representation of the formations, or some of the formations that we see in the park. Here's the Eagleford down below, again, because it's older, it's lower. Here's the lower part of the Austin Chalk, which is the part of the Austin Chalk we see mostly in the park. And this is the point I was making earlier. You can see that the Austin Chalk has these beds of hard limestone, characterized by brick-like structures, and then it's interbedded layers of shale, which are right here and right here. Now that's important. Now, so shale, limestone is really hard. It's calcium carbonate. Shale is really soft in general, has much smaller particles, clay and silt-sized particles, clay particles being so small they're invisible to the naked eye. But in aggregate, I mean, you can see it as rock, of course. But the point is that when we look at the landscape, where the landscape has Eagleford Shale at the surface, this stuff is pretty soft. It degrades the soil very quickly. Whereas the Austin Chalk, some of it degrades quickly and some of it does not. And so on the surface of the earth, we will see some layers of hard rock. We'll also see some pieces of those upper layers that are kind of remnants sitting on top of soil derived from these clay layers of Austin Chalk. And we'll continue to talk about that as we go through the slideshow. But the point is that different kinds of soils can be made from these different kinds of rocks, and we see that. We see that in the park. Here is an aerial map with some colors added in. This was a consulting firm that did some work, I think, before the actual creation of the park as they were planning it. These colors represent formations. Mostly this is Austin Chalk, this kind of color. This is Eagleford Shale. Most of this is, I think, like cemented alluvium and stuff. But up here is where the Salado Creek runs. And on these cliffs are really where you see, or the only place where you can see the Butte limestone. But the Butte limestone is really right below this lithified alluvium. If you know that little geology trail up there, kind of near Salado Creek, if you walk in there, you can see what that lithified alluvium looks like. And but directly below your feet is the Butte limestone. And here's that fault. Again, you can see on one side, you've got, this older rock, and then this side, which went down relative to that northern block, this side has younger rock, the Austin Chalk being younger than the Eagleford Shale. The other thing I want to point out is that when you walk in this area, again, remember the water loop is right over here, and you walk in that area, you'll notice the soils are very different from, the trails on this side. Of here, the trails are rockier. There's a lot of caliche, which is basically kind of a secondary deposit of calcium carbonate on the surface. It looks, it's rock, but it's not. It's a kind of a secondary kind of formation. But over here, the soils are a lot deeper. And although there's still, rock there, it's usually the pieces of rock in the soils derived from that Eagleford Shale. So, well, here's some images from these kind of the foundational materials of Hardberger Park. This is, of course, the observation deck over Salado Creek. It's a great viewpoint, but that rock, that bluff is Butte limestone. And as you can see, it's a pretty massive piece of formation. It's, at least, 35 feet of rock right there. And if you look closely, and this is like, as you go past Volker Lane and you're walking on the Greenbelt Trail, you come to a little tributary bridge, or a bridge over a tributary to Salado Creek. And if you look down on the bed of that tributary, you see this situation. This is the Butte. And so it's a very striking view. And we can see some, because it's a limestone, remember limestones, because they're calcium carbonate, they display a lot of solution features. And this is a good point at which to talk about, that limestones are often, a limestone situation at the surface of the earth are often called karst because they show different kinds of solutional features that result from the acids in rain. Carbonic acid, the weak carbonic acid is in rainfall. As raindrops move through the atmosphere, they take in carbon dioxide, which acidifies that rain slightly. It falls on calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate dissolves in acid. And over a long time, we develop these solutional features, caves, fissures, sinkholes, features like that, that in that limestone, and we can see a good example of that type of karst feature right here. This is a crevice that's been solutionally enlarged that allows water that falls or that either falls from the sky or flows in the creek or this tributary to go down deeper into the rock. And of course, we depend on that here in San Antonio because our aquifer, the Edwards limestone, has a recharge zone where that exact same process occurs, where water flowing or water falling from the sky goes into the aquifer and provides us with our drinking water. This is not the Edwards, it's the Buda, but it functions the same way or behaves the same way. And so we can see the solution feature nicely developed. These other holes, although they're probably solutionally enlarged, are actually trace fossils. These are the result of what's called bioturbation. And the Buda, again, as I mentioned, was, was a warm, shallow sea, had a limy mud, consisted or comprised of the bottom of that shallow sea. And there were organisms that burrowed through those muds. Think of, marine earthworms burrowing through those muds. Those burrows were filled in with material that was slightly differentially different from the muds that made up the floor of the ocean. And so those materials eroded or dissolved out preferentially faster than the really hard limestone that is the Buda. And so we see the evidence of those creatures bioturbation on the floor of that ancient sea. So again, this is 95 million years ago that this was happening. And so all of these holes are a result of that process. And this is another karst feature, a cave in the Buda limestone. This is just a little bit downstream from the observation deck over the creek. I think this is called, I forget what the name of this cave is, which is ironic because I was one of the people that surveyed it, back in the 70s. But anyway, which probably tells you why I've forgotten. But anyway, but you can see in this exposure, of this evidence of bioturbation, the trace fossils throughout this entire section of Buda limestone. So we know that those conditions under which this rock was being deposited in that tropical sea, the conditions remained unchanged for many, many years, for millions of years, literally. Now,
We've got a question from Jean Hackett asking, could
yes.
you at some point discuss the rock deposits and soil in the Borrow Pit on the Geology Trail?
Yeah. So the Borrow Pit is kind of, if you climbed up this, and got up here at the top of the bluff and walked a little in toward the park, you would come to the Borrow Pit. And when you go in there, you see, basically, fairly well consolidated materials, but they were deposited between 1 and 2 million years ago. These were stream deposits or materials that sloughed off of hillsides. So remember, climate has changed over billions of years, and we've had multiple ice ages. 12,000 years ago, the climate, there were glaciers in North America extending down to, through the Dakotas and et cetera, and climate was cooler, it was drier, all that stuff. So a lot of those deposits took place at that time because there was rock on top of this. You go to the top of this now and you walk where you walk, that wasn't there. That point was buried under alluvium that was washing down from basically the Edwards the Balcones Fault Zone, because remember, well, the Balcones Fault Zone occurred about 23 million years ago when it raised the hill country, the Everest Plateau up relative to the coastal plain. That created a lot of energy for water, moving water to wash debris, rocks, soil, gravel off of the Edwards Plateau and bring it down to where we are. Because basically where Hardberger Park is right on the southern margin of the Balcones Fault Zone, pretty much, or right there. And so to the west and to the north, land elevation was a lot higher than it is today. So 3 million years ago, there was a lot of energy, a lot of water action bringing deposits down into this area. And there was a lot of material being deposited on top of, whatever was at Hardberger Park at that point. Those deposits became, as water moved through them, water that was saturated with respect to calcium carbonate and other minerals, those minerals would precipitate out and bind those deposits together and basically lithifying them, turning them into rock, kind of like a conglomerate rock, a very young conglomerate, but still, And so, so then as the climate changed and as erosion wore the land down and the energy coming off the Everest Plateau reduced and the hills were worn down by both solution of the limestone and erosion of the landscape, Salado Creek came in and started eating away at the surface here. So the land mass was worn down to where we see it today. But part of that material, and again, going back to the burrow pit, that material that is there in the burrow pit that you see exposed in those cuts, that material represents those ancient deposits from the, basically from the hill country. I don't know if that answered the question, but so those are a lot younger deposits. They're, if the formation in reality in an undamaged stratigraphic section of the geology, you would see the Butte limestone, and right on top of that would be the Eagleford Shale. But the Eagleford Shale, at the point when those deposits were made in the burrow pit, Eagleford Shale had already been eroded away, had already been washed away. And then those deposits were stacked on top of that. And then they in turn were eroded away. And, by thousands and thousands of years of weathering. Anyway, that's what I think I know about that. Eagleford Shale, there's no picture because there's really no exposure of it. It's all turned to soil. I in the park, I've never found, I walked over and I've never been able to find an actual piece of the Eagleford Shale, although I'm walking on soil derived from it. So, and here's the final geologic piece that we're talking about, the Austin Chalk. And this is, of course, I only included this shot because it shows a really lovely bed. This is in places, this is a 3-foot thick bed of a bivalve fossil. It's a Pycnodonte ocella, I believe. And you can see really, massive collection of fossils. But it's interesting because this period of time, and this is again in the lower Austin Chalk, and this is an exposure in the creek. This part in time, was a very low energy environment because these shells are not all broken up. But we can see when we move up, this is the boundary between a real change between non-turbulent and very turbulent conditions in the deposition of the Austin Chalk in those Cretaceous oceans, because these pieces, the shells appear all fragmented. But this is, are there any questions at this point? Because now we're going to start talking about soils themselves, I think. Although we've alluded to soil somewhat.
So we've got a few questions. So
Yeah.
Jessica Garza asked, I would like to learn more about how rocks turn to soil, the processes involved, etc.
This is exactly what we're going to talk about now.
Okay, and then Jean Hackett asked, is that in Phil Hardberger Park?
It is not. It's downstream. It's Solid Creek downstream from Hardberger Park.
And Celicia Garza asked, do people have access to that cave?
Yeah, I was in there just the other day. I mean, there are two entrances to that cave. There's one in the creek. I think maybe it's called Emerald Pit. Anyway, regardless, there's that one that I showed you a picture of. And then there's like a surface entrance at the top of the cliff, like a pit, you can, drop in on a rope. So that upper entrance is gated, or it's got like bars over it, because that's kind of a dangerous thing to do. But you can go in the bottom entrance, yes.
All right, that's all our questions so far.
Okay.
She says, okay, thank you.
Sure. So let's talk about soil. Here's a soil map of Texas, and I included this because you can see here's Bexar County, and you can see that we're right on the kind of the border in Hardberger Park between the soils of the Edwards Plateau, which are up here, and which are generally thin, silty, cobbly soils, very with good porosity, but also extremely shallow soils, and the soils of basically the Blackland Prairie, which are derived from materials or formations with more clay and silt, and are therefore deeper soils, more well developed in terms of their soil horizons, but also which in some places have limited permeability because of the high clay content. Those of us who live on the very black high clay soils from the Blackland Prairie know that sometimes water sits in, when you plant something, water sits in that hole a long time. So Hardberger Park is pretty much right there on the boundary between those two soil types. You'll probably recognize that this is the area of Hardberger Park. We've got military over here, at Blanco here, Wurzbach cutting through. And these symbols represent different soil types within the park. There are descriptions of these soil types, which I haven't included because the differences are very slight. I mean, you talk about different slopes or different depths. And it's just, I include this slide just to show that there has been a lot of attention paid to the soils that exist here. But for our purposes, we're going to talk in more general terms about these soils. Well, if you're out on the landscape, this is a common view of what soil looks like in parts of Hardberger Park. We've got the soil with these large pieces of rock kind of dispersed. Some cases we have, some basement rock, which looks like what we have here. Other places we have these flat or other shaped pieces lying on the soil. What these pieces represent are those overlying layers. This is in an area of the park where there's Austin chalk. These pieces represent those hard layers of limestone above the shaly, clayey layers of in the Austin chalk. The soils are derived primarily from those layers of shale or those marly layers between the hard layers of limestone. So this is what soil consists of in general. It's appropriate to think of soil as being, it's kind of like the boundary between these different parts of the earth. It's the boundary where the atmosphere meets the lithosphere, the bedrock, meets the hydrosphere, or water of our planet, and the biosphere. Both the biosphere being the things on top of the soil and the things within the soil. And we'll talk about all that stuff. But all of those components of our planet are present in that boundary layer that we call soil. So how are soils formed? Well, first of all, you need to have some kind of parent material, which is bedrock. Whatever the bedrock is in the place you live, and in the soil you're talking about. So the bedrock or the parent material has an effect on the type of the soil, the texture of the soil, porosity of the soil, of course, obviously the mineral content of that soil, and so it's whether it's productive in terms of agriculture, things like that. Another factor in the formation of soil is climate, specifically temperature and rainfall or precipitation. So, because part of the formation of soil is dependent on chemical processes. So if you've got water, if you've got a warmer temperature, those kinds of chemical reactions that facilitate the development of soil from bedrock are enhanced. Whereas a cold, dry climate, those processes are considerably slower. Topography affects the development of soil. It's easy to walk around on hills and in this part of Texas, and there's virtually no soil. But if you walk down slope, down to where the stream channel is, their soil might be deep enough for cottonwoods. So, but a lot of the soil that formed or on that hill washes down into a topographically more stable location. So topography affects the development of soils as well. Time. Soil forms at a very slow rate. So the more time you have, the more time, the better a soil is going to be, the more developed the soil will be. If you've got new land, if you go to Iceland, the soils in Iceland are for the most part very young soils, sometimes very thin soils with very few horizons. But in other parts of the world where the bedrock material is more ancient or is much older, you've got much better soils, much deeper soils. Living organisms, again, we'll talk more about this, and we'll talk more about a number of these things as we go along. But living organisms also affect how soils form, what kinds of soils form, and the rate at which soils form. They, cause or facilitate nutrient cycling through soils, decomposition of organic materials in the soil, and they also profoundly affect soil structure. And soil structure is related to the porosity and permeability of soils, which is allows water and air to move into the soils through the soils, which is very important for any kind of life, plants among them. And humanity. Humanity is a factor in the formation of soils, or kind of like with numbers. We say in numbers we have positive numbers and we have negative numbers. Well, more often, humanity is one of those things that affects the formations of soils negatively. Farming techniques, construction techniques. How many times have you driven out, north of San Antonio and seen a hillside that's been bulldozed to the rock? Well, that's soil formation in a negative way. So we can have positive impacts on soil, and I think one of the goals of this talk is to show us how that's possible. When we talk about parent material, there are different kinds of bedrock or rock that make up that parent material. On the left, we see a piece of sandstone, and on the right, we see a piece of shale. Sandstone and shale are both clastic rocks. That means they're made of particles. That are the particles of sand in one case, or clay and silt in the other case. Those particles are cemented together it could be by calcium carbonate or silica or iron or different things, but then the process of lithification, or that sediments turning to rock, water flows through this loose material, and gradually minerals deposit out and form that kind of cementing matrix of the rock. And so we have sandstone made up of sand particles, and shale made up of clay and silt particles. So when those things break down, they form very distinctive types of soil, very different from each other. Think beach versus a mud pit. But other parent material, and these are parent materials that we have more commonly in our area, and certainly in Hardberger Park, limestone, which is calcium carbonate, and marl, which is like a mixture of calcium carbonate and particles of clay and silt, and maybe some sand, but mostly clay and silt. And you can see the marl is it's a softer rock. It has much finer grains. And in fact, the limestone really doesn't have grains. And this is the limestone when it doesn't fall apart. Like we can think of sandstone as coming apart, and then the sand is left behind because the matrix material has, dissolved away or something. So the sand is left. But limestone doesn't really fall apart because the matrix is the calcium carbonate itself. And what happens with limestone is that it simply dissolves and runs off in the stream or it goes underground. That calcium carbonate doesn't really leave much behind in the way of particles of soil, right? The marl, on the other hand, does, because the calcium carbonate that exists in that marl, sometimes called argillaceous limestone, the particles, yes, go ahead.
Just a quick question for Jessica Garza asking, is the second rock also known as micrite?
What was that term, micrite?
I might be saying it wrong, M-I-C-R-I-T-E.
I don't know that term. Yeah, I mean, it might, but I just couldn't say. Sorry.
All right. She says, okay, thanks.
Okay. So you can imagine that, so if you've got layers of limestone and then layers of marl and then a layer of limestone, as that limestone dissolves, it's really not going to leave much behind. But as that marl rock dissolves and softens and comes apart, it is actually going to leave some soil. And so that's a lot of what we see in Hardberger Park. The soil that we see are remnants of, or the mineral part of that soil, as opposed to like the organic part. The mineral part of that soil is usually a result of the marly layers in those limestones, or in the case of the Eagleford Shale, that entire formation is the particles in that. The limestone really doesn't leave much soil at all. Well, when you have things, you have that bedrock, and of course, how does that bedrock break down? Well, the bedrock will break down result of freezing. These are basically characterized as physical things, like ice forming in cracks. Water is one of those few things which when you freeze it, it actually gets larger, which is why if you put a completely full jar of water in your freezer, it'll crack the jar because ice expands. And so if you have wet rock and the water's in the cracks in the rock, and then overnight it freezes, the stress produced by that expanding water can flake off bits of rock. I mean, it can actually crack large pieces of rock. So that's a process. Repeated wet and drying conditions, as some rock, the clays in the rock will expand when they absorb water. For example, you can think of any kind of shale or shaling rock. Also plant roots. I mean, you see so many times where plant roots are snaking down into joints and cracks in the rock and forcing the rock apart. So those are physical things that cause weathering of the bedrock. There are also chemical things that affect that weathering. We talked about how the limestones can dissolve in weak acids, like rainfall acid. Rainfall will dissolve limestone. When you can have the development of organic acids as organic material decays. Let's say you've got a thin layer of soil and there's organic material on that soil and sits on bedrock underneath the ground. Well, that boundary between those soils and all of the organic acids being produced by their decomposition and decay, that boundary between the rock and the soil is under a lot of this kind of acidic stress. And those acids will dissolve that limestone and wear it down. Oxidation, hydration, you can see for example, granite up at Enchanted Rock, you'll see like the granite composed of feldspar, mica, and quartz typically. And like the feldspar will will absorb water over time and become flaky and kind of, collapse. And you can see places where, granite boulders or granite exposures, the quartz is being basically freed from its matrix of feldspar as that feldspar hydrates and dissolves. And there are, of course, biological forces that tend to have the capacity to weather rock. And I think, lichens and roots are good examples of those. Here's an example of a lichen. In fact, lichens are probably, or something very similar to lichens, are probably the first kinds of things. They aren't plants as such, but probably the first things on the surface of the earth. Before there were actually plants on Earth, there were probably lichens on the rocks, beginning to break down and cause those rocks to weather and come apart. And this is actually out at Enchanted Rock. There's some incredible lichens on the granites out there. There's another lichen, different species on this piece of rock.
We've got a quick question from
Yeah.
Gene Hackett
Yes,
asking, slightly off the subject, can you recommend an app for identification of rocks?
That is a really good question. And I can't, I'm sorry, but I bet there has to be one out there, right?
Yeah, probably.
I don't know. That's interesting. I've never thought about it. Thank you, Gene. I'll be looking for that. Let me know if you find one, please.
Yeah.
So you have weathering. So you've got your bedrock, your parent material. It's breaking down. Big rocks are being broken into smaller rocks by tree roots, by freezing, by thawing, by various processes. Gravel is being deposited at the foot of these, smaller boulders, and that's weathering. The next factor that comes into play when we talk about the development of soils is erosion. And the erosion is the movement of material away from its place of weathering. It's being carried away to some other location. And typically, this is good because it allows more bedrock to weather. It exposes bedrock to whatever processes are causing that bedrock to weather. That erosion will carry, a lot of times, erosion or weathering takes place on higher elevations, on hillsides, on mountainsides or mountain tops. And but the erosional material is carried to a more stable location in a valley or some intermediate location. So that accumulation of material in a more stable location allows it to undergo further processing, become more soil-like. And schematically, you can kind of think of it like this diagram represents it. Initially you've got some volcanic island that forms off the coast of Iceland. And so originally we just have a lot of basalt sitting there, exposed to the elements. And so rain falls, there are cracks in the rock from the cooling process. When the rock forms, it's hot, and as it cools, it kind of stresses develop in the rock that cause it to fracture, joints to form. And these are pathways for moisture, for water. So when it rains, water goes into those cracks, it begins to break it down. As we see in this picture, we've got these smaller and smaller pieces of rock. We have the development of organic matter at the surface. And you can see we have, as we go across, we have the development of distinct soil horizons. So in a mature soil, we can look at it and say we have these very distinctive regions. At the very surface, we have we have a lot of organic material. Some of it just a leaf that fell off a tree. It hasn't been processed yet. And then as we go deeper, we have more processing has taken place. We've got more root activity. We've got more microbial life. And as we go deeper and deeper, though, the mineral content increases, but the biologic content decreases the deeper you go. And so you've got in your B horizon, you've got very few organisms really. Yeah, as you go deeper, you've got a lot more, larger and larger rocks until you finally get down to the bedrock layer. However, the soil horizons that exist depend very much on where you are. There's another idealized soil representation of the different layers of soil. Now, however, this is what soil horizons look like in the hill country, right? Very poorly developed soils in general. So you've got very thin layers of where there's high organic material, the decomposing sections, and suddenly you're just almost immediately in bedrock. I mean, here you can see some, smaller pieces of bedrock that have been, formed in this road cut. So the bedrock, the pieces of bedrock, and then you've got your soil horizon, the pieces of rock sitting on top of that. So soil can be characterized by the size of the particles as well. Clay particles are the smallest particles of soil, and they're invisible to the naked eye, even though when you collect them all together, they are a rock. But unless they are connected or combined, they're invisible to the eye. Silt is the next largest, which is visible, but very small still. And then you've got sands. Sand is visible to the naked eye. And
So we've got a couple of quick questions.
yes,
Sherry asks, would you define bedrock?
bedrock is the undisturbed native, rock in an area. It hasn't been, it's what was, there is no soil below the bedrock.
Okay. And then Jessica Garza asks, when you can address, no rush, what causes those concentric circles in the first picture, assuming that was limestone?
Here, I imagine this, when they made this road cut, it's the machinery that cuts that rock. It's like I assume it's some kind of, sometimes you see the different kind of trenching material or trenching machines that go through an area. Maybe it's something like that, I would think. But it's definitely, human made.
She says, okay.
Yeah. But here's a nice little karst feature, a little solution tube that goes down. Obviously, this used to be this was probably an open space that filled up with clay over time. Anyway. You can represent soil texture on this kind of confusing graph. On this side, we have the percent of silt from 0 to 100, percent of clay from 0 to 100, and sand. Many people consider the ideal soil to be a medium loam. And the reason that is because, like, if a rock is pure clay, clay bonds to water and it holds a lot of water, but it doesn't release it. So it's like kind of impermeable to the movement of water. Silt is, because they're somewhat larger particles, has more permeability. And permeability is the ability of a liquid to move through a substance. So silt is good in the sense that it's smaller and it doesn't hold water as much as clay. And sand adds a lot of structure to soil, but if it is 100% sand, it provides no moisture retention. So it has high permeability. The water flows through the sand nicely, but it doesn't have residual porosity where the water stays in the sand. So you want a mix of basically all of these things, either a medium or a clay loam. In this area will be particles for a kind of soil that'll hold moisture. It'll allow the movement of water as well as air through that soil. Most plants prefer, so we talk about pH of things, and that's whether it's acidic or alkaline. And most plants prefer a slightly acidic soil. The Of course, here in our part of the world, our soils are derived from limestone, and that calcium carbonate makes them a very alkaline soils or alkaline soil, which means that they have a pH range above 7, 7 being neutral on the pH scale. However, the development of organic material in the soil, whether it's in form of living organic creatures or compost and decaying organic matter, that adds acidity to the soil and basically moderates that alkalinity. So that's why you want to have a soil, even in our area, rich in organic material because it benefits the plants. But living soil, we've talked about our processes for the most part. I mean, aside from a little bit about the function of living organisms in soil, but for the most part, we've talked about kind of mineral processes taking place. But soil is a lot more than that. Living soil consists of life. So here's a representation of urban soils, which would a lot I find around here, obviously. And in these kinds of soils, we have a lot of mineral. We have very little organic material. In a forest soil, you notice that there's a lot more organic material. But not only that, there's more air and water. And that's partly because organic materials in the soil, and again, I'm including living organic materials, not just passive, not just compost, not just decayed leaves, but they add a lot of structure to that soil. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment, but that structure is what allows oxygen and water to be stored in and move through that living soil, that forest soil in this case. Without those, we have a lot of mineral and we don't have anywhere near the amount of air and water that we really need for a healthy soil. Well, human beings have evolved on the earth, and we have what is called a microbiome, and primarily in our gastrointestinal tract. We have about 100 trillion, microbes in our gut or in our bodies, and the vast majority of those are beneficial. In fact, a couple of pounds of them in total. And the role that those things play, they're not just parasites or fellow travelers, they actually facilitate a lot of our functions as organisms. And so we have a symbiosis with these organisms. And plants and soils are the same, and they in fact have had longer to co-evolve. And so we should expect to see some relationship between them. So when we look at a healthy soil, here's a graphic representing, a tablespoon of soil has 6 billion microbes, 75,000 species of bacteria, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of life in a small amount of a healthy soil. There's another representation of soil. So in this shows that the volume we're talking about is a cup of undisturbed native soil. It can have 100 kilometers of fungi in it. So this fungi, these are the hyphae that, or what make the fungi, or what's what the fungi consist of, are thin, in some cases microscopic, threads that permeate a healthy soil. There are also billions of bacteria, millions of protozoa, thousands of nematodes, as well as arthropods in that 1 cup of soil. These things all play different roles, and they don't exist to play those roles. They play those roles because, like on the surface of the earth, and as naturalists, we appreciate this. We know that things are connected, and they're connected because they have evolved together, and in order to survive, we have found that we survive better sometimes when we work with other organisms. We depend on other organisms for survival, and they depend on us. So we're going to look at some of these the microfauna and macrofauna that exist in the soil and what roles they play as we go on now. So we're looking at the life in the soil, some of the organic material in the soil. So we'll first talk about bacteria, because they are tiny, 1 micron in diameter. It's a millionth of a meter. A hair is follicles a hair is like maybe 50 microns. So they're microscopic. In a healthy soil, in an acre of healthy soil, you have about a ton of bacteria, or can have about a ton of bacteria. Most of these bacteria are decomposers. Some are mutualist rhizobia bacteria, or those that are associated with many types of legumes, forming the rhizobia nodules on the roots that provide nitrogen for the plants and fix nitrogen in the soil, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So, of course, some bacteria are pathogens. But what they do is decompose those organic materials, stabilize nutrients and minerals in the soil. Think of it, if you just have like a nutrient in the soil, let's say you have some potassium there, or maybe some phosphorus in the soil, just some atoms of phosphorus, and the first rain that comes along is going to wash that right away. What bacteria do is they incorporate these nutrients into their body structure, just like we are composed of a lot of different minerals and elements. So are bacteria. And they bind themselves to soil particles and with organic glues and other materials like that. And in the process of doing that, they resist being washed away. And that preserves those nutrients in the form of the bacteria themselves in those soils. And so stabilizing the nutrients ultimately makes those nutrients available for other types of life, including plants. They improve water movement in soil. Again, because they create these organic materials, they bond to each other, to soil particles. They create structure in the soil that increase the permeability of that soil and the porosity of that soil. Some of them, like the rhizobia, fix nitrogen, which is all proteins. Plants and animals require nitrogen, but the difficulty you can't just breathe it in. The atmosphere is 70% nitrogen, but that's in the form of a nitrogen molecule, N2. We can't just breathe that in and then incorporate it into our bodies somehow. It has to be in very specific forms, and bacteria change that, or some bacteria change that into a form that we can take into, or plants, and we ultimately can take into our bodies to use for protein. And this kind of illustrates the nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form of N2. And before there was bacterial life, the only way that N2 was processed into ammonium or nitrates was through lightning strikes, or lightning would moving through the air would basically cause a chemical change that would break up that N2 molecule into NO3 or NO2. And so you can see in this kind of graphic over here. However, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the rhizobia group of bacteria, fix nitrogen. They can process N2 into ammonium and nitrates, and that makes it available for plants and then ultimately for animals that browse or feed on those plants. So, and then when living things decay, that organic nitrogen goes back into the soil and available for somebody else. But that's why, rhizobium, which here's a picture of some roots, plant roots with the rhizobia nodules. That's why it's so important. And it was probably one of the first symbiotic relationships between bacteria and plants in the early history of plants on Earth. So, although to my knowledge, I don't know if there's any evidence for that, but I mean, just thinking about it, that's probably the case. The next kind of micro or component of the microfauna, well, it's not really fauna because fungi is not a plant or an animal, but it's its own thing. But it is certainly a microorganism in the soil, and it's an important one. So really, there's not, I mean, we see on the surface of the earth, we see fruiting bodies of fungi that we call mushrooms, but those are not the fungi itself. Fungi really exist as like threads called hyphae in the soil. And these threads can be cover huge areas, but they're very small. And they can be, just, of all different lengths. But a single fungus can produce fruiting bodies that cover the area of a baseball diamond. Good. Here's what fungi do. As we know, I mean, we've seen plenty of fungi in operation on, logs in the forest, and they decompose organic matter. And one of the most important things about fungi is that they decompose really tough kinds of organic materials that bacteria have a difficult time processing, like, cellulose and chitin. The hyphae that is the fungus, the fungi, it binds the soil together. It holds the soil together. Again, we've talked about how bacteria using organic glues can kind of bind soil particles together. The hyphae do very much the same thing. Because they're so tiny, they can go into places in the soil that roots of plants can't go. And by kind of permeating the entire soil zone or the organic part of the soil zone, they hold that soil in place, creating stable aggregates. And these aggregates in turn improve both water flow and airflow, as well as the water retention ability of those soils that the fungi is in. And that's why, now when you plant a plant, you want to make as small a hole as possible, because what you don't want to do is disturb the fungi that exist in that soil. I mean, you want to disturb it the least possible amount. That's why nowadays, a lot of modern agriculture focuses on, non-plowing in agriculture, because plowing, you plow deep and you plow hard and you destroy this structure in the soil and in the form of fungi. So mycorrhizal fungi colonize most plant roots and provide nutrients and water. So this is, a lot of research is done now. Mycorrhizal fungi are specific kinds of fungi that have a symbiotic relationship with plants. They don't just decompose organic matter. They actually work with plants. They deliver nutrients and water to the plant in exchange for nutrients from the plant. We'll talk more about that in a bit. However, it's estimated that as much as 80 or 90% of all plant species, because this is not unique to Hardburger, it's worldwide, but 80 to 90% of plant species benefit from mycorrhizal fungi. And we'll show some illustrations in a bit. Another element of the soil flora, fauna, and protozoa, single-celled creatures. There are different kinds of protozoa, but they're all single-celled for the most part. Even though there are many different types, they're primarily predators. They feed on bacteria, protozoa. Some of them do process organic matter. They also predate on fungi. They're small. And as a result of this predation, for example, they eat some bacteria, they eat some fungi. They don't need all of the nutrients that are in that. And so a lot of that gets pooped out. Well, that is in a form then that is available for plants. Those stored nutrients in the bodies of that bacteria and that fungi then are available for plants. And so protozoa then are part of that nutrient cycling that occurs in a healthy soil. where you've got that food web taking place. They're herbivores, they're predators at different levels. They're predators of predators. But in all, none of the nutrients go to waste. They keep getting recycled, and they're part of that process. And because they are predatory on the bacteria and fungi that are in the vicinity of the plant roots, they make the nutrients that result from that digestive process available for those plant roots. Nematodes are, it's kind of worm-like creatures, or in appearance, they're small, but they're not necessarily microscopic. They perform different functions in the soil. Again, we're focusing kind of like with the protozoas, primarily nutrient cycling that they do. The vast majority of nematodes, even though if you mention it to the gardening, a nursery or something like that, there are all these poisons to get rid of nematodes, but for the most part, nematodes are incredibly beneficial. They're part of the functions of nutrient cycling in the soil. They feed on pretty much everything, including other nematodes. Arthropods are also in the soil. They're mostly macroscopic, although some are microscopic. All the things that you find there in the soil, that have legs pretty much, or that burrow, are arthropods. They are shredders, predators, herbivores, and fungal feeders. So they're part of that very important nutrient cycling process. Some of them, by burrowing, aerate the soil, creating porosity as well as permeability. Sometimes they break larger pieces of organic material into smaller pieces that facilitates its decomposition by bacteria. And finally, the last thing we'll talk about are earthworms. They don't really need much of an introduction. We're familiar with them. They fragment organic material. They recycle nutrients because they have very specific bacteria in their gut that helps them process the difficult organic materials. When they poop, they add that kind of microbiome to the soil. And so that kind of stimulates microbial activity. Again, because they burrow, they aerate the soil, and they increase permeability and porosity of the soil. Well, let's talk more specifically about plants. We know about plants and that, what they do and what makes them distinctive is that they use photosynthesis to create themselves and actually to enable the rest of the living world. Using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, they produce carbohydrates and oxygen. But plants need more than carbs. So a lot of the nutrients they need, come from the soil, as well as the water they need, primarily comes from the soil. The roots of a plant are limited in extent. They're also limited in terms of size. Roots are, we look at them and say, oh, that's a thin root, that's very skinny. But in reality, when you talk about the size of pore spaces in soil, sometimes those roots are much larger than the pore spaces. And there are places within those soil particles, within that soil structure, that those roots can't reach, even in the immediate vicinity of the plants. And most plants prefer a slightly acidic soil. So, kind of getting back to what we talked about earlier, the plants that exist today on Earth have evolved with the soil microfauna and microflora. They have developed different mechanisms for mutual support. Neither of them is independent of the other, or not. They can be, but they don't want to be. And they don't flourish, for the most part, when they're independent of each other. So what does that look like? What are we talking about in terms of interdependence? Well, as much as 80% of the energy, let's say the carbohydrates and such produced by plants, as much as 80% of that goes into the roots. And a large part of that it's not used to grow the roots, although part of it is. But a large part of that 80% of the energy produced through photosynthesis by plants goes into producing what are called exudates. So these are things that are extruded or exuded by the roots of the plant, primarily polysaccharides, sugars, carbohydrates, also amino acids, and some fats. So these things, and so what's the purpose of that? I mean, it's like wasting. It's like pouring your soup on the ground. Why don't you just eat it? Why do you use all that energy that you produce? Why don't you grow some more leaves or something? The point of those exudates is that attracts a microfauna to the proximity of the roots of the plant. And those microfauna, the initial ones that are attracted, I mean, kind of think of it in terms of a timeline, like, oh, here's some sugar coming out of these roots. Well, what's going to be attracted to the delicious sugar? Well, those things that can't produce sugars, right? So fungi and bacteria are going to flock to the root zone called the rhizosphere. They're going to flock to that root zone to, get that delicious, sugar water that the plant has been in efforts, producing, and it's leaking out of that root system. So you initially have, bacteria and fungi moving into that rhizosphere. So that has different functions. First of all, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water here. So first of all, these bacteria and fungi really form incredibly dense layers around the roots, and that limits the access of pathogenic types of organisms, including pathogenic bacteria or protozoa or nematodes even. But so first of all, there's a benefit in that competition for space, to the plant just from protection from these pathogens. But the second thing that happens, another thing that happens, is that because suddenly we have all of these herbivores basically there, around the roots of the plant, well, that attracts the predators, which, among them, protozoa and nematodes, and other, types of fungi, to basically all that cattle, all that, prey that's in that root zone. And in the process of consuming and then, expelling the waste products of those initial bacteria and fungi, the nutrients that were embedded in the bodies, that were contained in the bodies of those microfauna and micro creatures, are available in the immediate vicinity of the root. And so the plants have attracted the bacteria and the fungi, only to have it then get eaten and those nutrients be cycled into the structure of the plant.
We've got a question from Liz Robbins asking, is this sugar attractive to insects, i.e. ants, or is the size too small for insects?
Yeah, that is, I don't know, to be honest. It's something, it's not like, so when we talk about, these exudates, I don't think it's like they're super deliciously sweet. It's not like you could just, pull a piece of Johnson grass out of the ground and just eat the roots and be, oh, this is delicious. I think that it's probably, it's much more subtle than an ant might appreciate. Now, the ants would probably love to eat some of the other creatures that are associated with, that soil life, or at least depending on the type of ant. But I think, I suspect that probably the sweetness of those exudates is not sufficient to be attractive to the ants. Excuse me.
She says, okay, LOL.
Oh, Liz. Anyway, so here's a graphic representing, so we see kind of a root tip on the left with various terms. And on the right, we see an actual microscopic photograph showing some of the mycorrhizal fungi that are actually attaching themselves to that root. And one of the things that the hyphae from the fungi, and I think I've got a better picture. Here's another one. So you can see the fungi, the hyphae, attached to the roots and extend out into the soil. Again, it can go many meters out into the soil. And one of the roles that these hyphae plays is that they deliver water and nutrients directly to the roots. There are two types of mycorrhizal fungi, one of which, you can see that on the right, one of which is only attached to the surface of the root, and the other of which actually penetrates into the structure of the root to deliver nutrients and water. So that symbiotic relationship is a super important one to the plant. This is another image, a photograph, a microscopic photo of a root tip, as well as the hyphae that are extending off of that root tip and on into the soil, or in this case, probably a fluid. But again, you can see, so this is a root tip. So it's a very small thing. There's no scale on here, but you can imagine that is an extremely small root. But look how much smaller the hyphae are. And imagine how much more volume in the soil they can access compared to that root. So the role of the hyphae in providing nutrients and water to the root and helping that plant survive cannot be overstated. A plant can get by with just roots, but it's not like it's going to thrive without that symbiotic relationship with the fungus. And that is the end. But I'm happy to take any questions you all might have.
All right, so if you have any final questions for Gary, now would be the time to bring them up. We've got some comments. Teresa says, I'm going to have to leave. Thank you so much for this great talk. It was very informative. Liz Robbins says, wow, that was fantastic, Gary.
Thank you.
Mark Rollins says, thank you. And we've got a question from Sherry asking, do mycorrhiza develop in potted plants?
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they can. Now, and in fact, a lot of research. So there is an increasing amount of research being done about the relationship between plants and fungi and bacteria and all these organisms, primarily bacteria and fungi. But and so we're learning new stuff all the time. In fact, up in the Northwest, they had a project where they experimented with actually like inoculating seedlings of conifers, when they'd plant them, to see if that stimulated the development of, symbiotic and supportive mycorrhiza, fungi for those plants, specific plants. So there's a lot of stuff that continues to go on. I see no reason why, they wouldn't develop. I mean, you might want to, if you have a potted plant and you get a bag of soil or something in the nursery and you have this potted plant, you might want to go out to what is a healthy soil and, dig some soil up and kind of put it in there to inoculate your planting, your potted plant, to provide hopefully some spores of some beneficial, fungus. But
all right, so some more questions and comments. Jeanette says, awesome. Aaron Harrison says, thank you, from someone in the Lindheimer NPSOT chapter.
Oh, sure, of course.
April Thomason says, enjoyed it. So much action underground.
I know. It's incredible.
And now a few questions. One from Sherry. Do you know of resources to teach elementary age children about soil?
That's a good question. I mean, the USDA might be a place, National Conservation, and I forget. They have a department within the USDA that deals with soils, and they might have some curriculum or some curricular materials, but I don't know, to be honest.
And then Celicia Garza asks, Where downstream was the picture of the bivalve fossils taken? I'd like to walk down and see it in person.
Oh gosh. As I mean, I would estimate it was probably about a mile downstream. I mean, like if you go to, like measured from where Salado, where the creek goes under Blanco, probably about a mile downstream is my estimate.
And then
There's also an exposure in the Austin Chalk and Leon Creek as well. I mean,
okay. As Sherry asks, where was your final picture taken?
Oh, I didn't take that. I stole that.
Nancy says, enjoyed the program. And somebody else asks, if you inoculate houseplants with fungi, would that somehow harm the indoor air we breathe if they release spores and we breathe them in?
Well, I mean, that could be an argument against going outside. So I mean, I can't say never, but I mean, unless you're really susceptible. I mean, there's spores all around, right? So I would think that probably those, I mean, I'm not a doctor, and these days, perhaps I shouldn't. I'm not going to worry about that, but I mean, that's a personal choice, I think. I can't imagine that would be a problem.
Wendy Drezick asked, Catherine, can I tell them where to find materials for kids on soil science? Soil science, sorry. Wendy, yes, absolutely.
Please. Yeah.
So I'm going to, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was
Yes.
going to unmute, and we have two computers on, so it's echoing. But if you Google soil science for kids, there's all sorts of stuff. I've got on the Master Naturalist for very young kids, a one called Rockin' and Rollin', but there's lots of stuff that is prepared for kids. They're excellent books that teach about the soil horizons and all of these things for children. If anyone is interested in finding them, just Catherine or Gary, just give them my email and I can pass on some of the books that I've used to teach soil to younger kids, elementary age kids. But there's tons of stuff if you just Google soil science for kids.
Cool.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yes, let me know if you'd like Wendy's contact information, and I can get you guys in touch with each other. She's a great resource for early elementary science education. Oh, any more questions before we wrap up here?
Well, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. Before we close out, thank you all for joining us for this talk. If you're interested in learning more about Hardberger Park and the conservancy that supports it, please visit philhardbergerpark.org. The Conservancy is a member-based nonprofit that relies on donations to support educational activities in the park. If you're able to give $5 or $10 to support programs like today's, we would really appreciate it. This, as we mentioned before, will be recorded and shown on our website, so you can always come back and visit this talk. Is there a link for the donations? You should be able to find it on the Phil Hardberger Park website. And thank you so much, everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.